and suddenly everything vanished from my memory, as I am writing now, leaving silence and emptiness. On the trunk by the door sat grandmother, bent double, motionless, and hardly breathing. I stood in front of her and stroked her warm, soft cheeks. She didn't seem to notice, and muttered gloomily, "Good God, did your stock of common sense run out when it came to my sons? Lord, please help us." I imagine that grandfather didn't live more than 1 year in that house in Holyvoy Street from one spring to another, but during that time the house took on a new notoriety. Almost every Sunday the street urchins would run up to the front door, joyfully announcing to everyone in the street, "There's another fight at the Casherans." Usually Uncle Mikhail appeared in the evening and kept the house under siege and in a state of terror the whole night. Sometimes he brought 2 or 3 assistants, scruffy louts from the Kunavina quarter. They used to climb up from the gully into the garden and give full vent to their drunken ecstasy, pulling up the raspberry and blackcurrant bushes. On one occasion they smashed up the bathhouse and broke everything that could be broken, shelves, benches, kettles. They even tore up the stove from the floor, smashed some of the floorboards, and ripped the door out of its frame. Grandfather stood by the window, a threatening, speechless figure, and listened to them smashing his house up. Hidden in the darkness, grandmother ran around the yard pleading, "Misha, what are you doing?" And she was answered by a string of obscene and idiotic Russian oaths, whose meanings must have been incomprehensible even to the animals that spewed them up. There was no chance of being with grandmother at a time like this, and without her I was terrified. I went down to grandfather's room only to be greeted with a hoarse shout, "Clear off, blast you." I fled up to the attic and stared out through the window into the murky garden, trying not to let my grandmother out of sight. I was terrified they might kill her, and I cried out and called to her. She did not come, but my drunken uncle heard me and started abusing grandmother with foul language. One evening, which was very much like this in many respects, grandfather was ill and lay in bed rolling his head, which had a towel tied around it from side to side, grumbling, "Is this what I've lived, enslaved, and sinned for? If it weren't for the shame of it, I'd call the police and have them up before the governor in the morning. What a disgrace. How can a father set the police on his own sons?" "You've said enough, old man, so lie still." Suddenly he jumped out of bed and staggered to the window. Grandmother caught hold of him under the arms and asked, "Where do you think you're going?" "Light a candle," he ordered, gulping noisily for breath. When grandmother had lit the candle, he took the candlestick, holding it out in front like a rifle, and shouted through the window in a loud, mocking voice, "Ah, Mishka, thief in the night, you mangy hound." Just then the uppermost pane in the window was shattered, and half a brick landed on the table near grandmother. "Missed!" roared grandfather, and I wasn't sure whether he was laughing or crying. Grandmother caught him up in her arms, just like me, and carried him to bed, murmuring in a voice full of fear and trembling, "What are you going on about? If you went to the police, it would be Siberia for him. Surely he understands that, mad though he is." Grandfather twitched his legs and sobbed hoarsely, "I hope they kill him." From outside came the sound of roaring and banging, and I took the brick and ran to the window. Grandmother managed to catch me and fling me into the corner. "Little idiot," she hissed. On another occasion, my uncle, armed with a thick stake, broke into the house from the yard and stood on the steps of the dark porch, beating on the door, behind which waited grandfather with a stick in his hands, 2 lodgers with clubs, and a tall woman with a rolling pin. Grandmother stamped about and pleaded, "Let me go speak to him, just one word." Grandfather stood up, sticking his leg out like the peasant carrying the spear in a painting called "The Bear Hunt." When grandmother approached him, he silently shoved her away with his elbow and leg. All 4 stood there, terrified, expecting the worst. Above them burnt a lamp which hung from the wall and flickered, casting a dim, feeble light on their heads. I watched all this from the attic ladder and felt like carrying grandmother up with me. Uncle was furiously breaking down the door, and now it was hanging perilously, ready at any moment to come away at the top hinge. The lower was already broken off and made a horrible grating noise. Grandfather urged on his helpers in a voice that grated as well. Hit him on the arms and legs, mind, but not on the head. By the side of the door was a small window, just big enough to get your head through. Uncle had broken through the glass in it, and now it had turned black, like a socket without the eye, with bits of splintered glass sticking out all around the edges. Grandmother rushed up to it, thrust her arm through, and waved it around. "Misha, for God's sake, go away," she shouted. "You'll be crippled for life. Get out of here." He hit her on the arm with his stake. I could see something very broad-looking flash across the window, immediately after which Grandmother slumped down to the floor on her back and just managed to cry out, "Misha, get out of here. Run." "Was that you, Mother?" wailed Grandfather, frightening me out of my wits. The door burst open, and my uncle jumped through the black opening, only to be thrown backwards off the porch like a shovelful of earth. The innkeeper's wife took Grandmother to Grandfather's room. He soon followed her there, gloomily went up to her and said, "Any bones broken?" "Yes, I think so," she replied without opening her eyes. "What have you done with him?" "Leave off, won't you?" snapped Grandfather. "Do you think I'm a wild animal or something? He's lying tied up in the barn. I doused him with some water. The swine. Which one of us does he take after, then?" Grandmother just groaned. "I've sent for the bone setter, so be patient for a bit," said Grandfather, moving close to her on the bed. "There'll be the death of us both. They'll send us to our graves before our time. Let them have all the money." And Varvara? They talked for a long time, Grandmother softly, plaintively, Grandfather angrily and noisily. Then a little hunchbacked old woman came in. Her lower jaw trembled. Her mouth was wide open like a fish, and her sharp nose curved round into it over her upper lip. I couldn't see that she had any eyes, and she could hardly shuffle along, scraping her crutches along the floor. In her hand was a bundle which jingled as she walked. I thought that this was death in person who'd come for my grandmother. I leapt over her and shouted at the top of my voice, "Get out!" Grandfather roughly caught hold of me and hauled me off to my attic without any further ceremony. It did not take me long to understand that Grandfather and Grandmother worshipped different gods. Grandmother would wake up and sit for a long time on the edge of the bed, combing her wonderfully long hair, with her teeth clenched. She would twitch her head and tear out whole plaits of long black silky hair and curse under her breath so as not to wake me. To hell with this hair all matted into a lump. I can't do a thing with it. When she had somehow managed to disentangle her hair, she would quickly plait it into thick strands, hurriedly wash herself, snorting angrily, and then stand before her icons without having succeeded in washing away the irritation from her large face, all wrinkled with sleep. And now would begin the real morning ablution, which straightway completely refreshed her. She would straighten her stooping back, throw her head back, and gaze lovingly at the round face of the Virgin of Kazan, throw her arms out wide, cross herself fervently, and whisper noisily in a heated voice, "Blessed Virgin, remember us in times of trouble." She would bow down to the floor, slowly unbend, and then whisper again ardently, "Source of all joys, purest beauty, flowering apple tree." Almost every morning she would find some new words of praise which made me listen to her prayers with even greater attention. "Dearest heart of heaven, my refuge and protection, golden sun, mother of God, save us from evil. Grant we offend no one, and that I in turn be not offended without just cause." Her dark eyes smiled, and she seemed to grow younger again as she crossed herself again, with slow movements of her heavy hand. "Jesus Christ, Son of God, be merciful to me, poor sinner, for thine own mother's sake." Her prayers were always a service of sincere praise that came straight from her heart. She didn't pray long in the mornings, as the samovar had got to be ready. Grandfather didn't keep any servants, and if Grandmother was late with the morning tea, which had to be served exactly on time, he would curse her long and angrily. Sometimes he would wake earlier than grandmother, climb up to the attic, and catching her at her prayers, would listen to her whispering for some time, disdainfully twist his thin, dark lips, and growl at her later when they were having tea. How many times, blockhead, have I taught you how to pray, and still you mutter in your own sweet way like a heretic? God will lose his patience one day. Don't worry, he'll understand, answered grandmother convincingly. He can understand whatever I say to him. Blasted Chuvash. Her God was with her all day, and she even talked about him to animals. It was plain that it was easy for everything to submit to this God. People, dogs, birds, bees, even herbs. He bestowed his kindness on all earthly creatures without distinction, and was close to all things. One day the cat belonging to the innkeeper's wife, a spoiled, cunning, fawning creature with a sweet tooth, smoky-colored fur, and golden eyes, and the favorite of everyone in the yard, dragged a starling in from the garden. Grandmother took the tortured bird away and started scolding the cat. You've no fear of God, you miserable wretch. The innkeeper's wife and the man who looked after the yard both laughed at this, but grandmother shouted furiously at them. You think that animals don't know about God? Every living thing knows about God, just as much as you and I. Don't you feel any pity? As she harnessed the plump, mournful Sharap, she chatted to him. Why are you so down in the dumps, my servant of God? Getting old, aren't you? The horse would sigh and shake his head. All the same, she didn't mention God by name as often as grandfather did. Grandmother's God I could understand, and he didn't terrify me, yet it was impossible to tell a lie in his presence. That would have been shameful. All he aroused in me was a feeling of overwhelming guilt, and I never lied to grandmother. It was simply impossible to hide anything from this benevolent God, and I had no wish to do so either. One day the innkeeper's wife had a quarrel with grandfather, let grandmother have the full force of her tongue, though grandmother had nothing to do with it, and even threw a carrot at her. You idiot, my grandmother said calmly, but I was deeply hurt and decided to take revenge on the evil woman. For a long time I tried to think of a way of inflicting the greatest possible pain on that red-headed fat woman with her double chin and eyeless face. From my observations of the civil wars raged by the neighbors, I discovered that they took revenge on each other by chopping off cats' tails, poisoning dogs, and killing cocks and hens, or by creeping into the enemy's cellar at night, pouring kerosene into barrels of pickled cabbage and cucumbers, or emptying casks of kvass. But none of this was drastic enough for me. Something far more impressive and terrifying was needed. And this is what I thought up. I waited until the innkeeper's wife had gone down to the cellar, and then shut the hatch and locked it over her, danced a dance of revenge over it, flung the key on to the roof, and rushed as fast as my legs could take me to the kitchen, where grandmother happened to be doing the washing. It took her some time to find out why I was so delighted, and when she did, she gave me a smack in the right place, dragged me outside, and sent me up on the roof after the key. Amazed at this reception, I silently retrieved the key and then ran off to one corner of the yard, from where I could see grandmother freeing the captive innkeeper's wife. Then both of them, laughing all over their faces, came towards me across the yard. You'll get it from me, said the innkeeper's wife, threatening me with her plump fist, but still smiling benevolently with that eyeless face of hers. Grandmother took hold of me by the scruff of the neck and hauled me off to the kitchen, where she asked me, What did you do that for? She threw a carrot at you. So you did it for me? Well, what a nerve. I've a good mind to put you under the stove to keep the mice company. Perhaps that will knock some sense into you. A fine protector. If I told your grandfather, he'd fillet you alive. Off to the attic and learn your lessons for tomorrow. The whole of the day she didn't say one word to me except in the evening, when before saying her prayers, she sat down on the bed and told me these memorable words. Listen, Angel, and don't forget, don't meddle with things that don't concern you. Grown-ups are soiled by life. They have already been put to the test by God. But you haven't, and you have a child's way of looking at things. Wait until God puts you on trial, touches your heart, and shows you your appointed tasks and the path you must tread. Understand that it's not for you to decide who should be punished. God will judge and give punishment where it's due. That's His business, not ours." For a moment she was silent, then she took her snuff, blinked her right eye, and added, "Sometimes even God can't tell who's guilty." "But doesn't God know everything?" I asked in astonishment. She answered in a calm and sad voice, "If He knew everything, then people wouldn't do a lot of things. He looks down on us from heaven, and at times He has such fits of crying and sobbing. My people, my dear people, I'm so sorry for you.